that's not so hard. Guys, jumping right in. We had our Chapter 2 assignment that was due on Friday midnight. Several of you did not submit the assignment because we are week 4 in the semester. If you did not submit the assignment, please get it in by 9 a.m. tomorrow. I would rather give anybody a 9 out of 10 than a 0. So if you did not submit it, please do so. Guys, one of the other things too, no points off for this, but if you did submit it as a text entry, if you could please resubmit as a Word file. The reason being is that I have to edit your work and give feedback. If it's pure text, I can't do that right in your document. So from here on out, anytime we have a writing assignment, please submit it as Microsoft Word. So, any questions about that before we get in, guys? Okay, excellent. Guys, your next assignment is going to be due on the 27th. Again, not due on a Monday because that was part of our agreement. I'm asking you after our chapter to tell me whether or not you think that federal and state workers should be allowed to unionize. And give me a why or why not. I'm saying 1 to 3 pages. Guys, if you can do it 1 page, that's wonderful, but I do insist that you give me sources for this. So this is due on the 27th. We'll be covering this more in class as we get in. Guys, I want to get right in today, too. We had a very unusual speaker on Friday, and I'd love to get your feedback. Feedback or thoughts?
I thought he was awesome.
Tell me more. Like, what did you learn from our time with Jim?
He spoke a lot of like the history and a lot of why the union was important and why he believed in the importance of the union, which was good to get someone's perspective like that.
I felt like he definitely had passion for the subject, but we wish he would speak. Other reactions? What did you guys think of Jim? Yes.
Yeah, I liked it. I liked it because it seemed really dedicated to his job and that he enjoyed what he did. So he made the stories more interesting.
I had lunch with Jim that day, and we talked for probably another hour and 15 minutes just about some of his stories from the old days. I found that to be interesting too. What other reactions do you have? You can have any reactions you wonder because there was some stuff that was keeping it real. Yes.
I love his personal stories, or like religious things, kind of crazy, honestly. What his own experiences, things he very
What is there anything in particular that really stuck with you?
I can't believe he was going through the person's trash and stuff, looking for I don't know, so trying to find out about them. That's annoying.
It's funny when you think about in terms of how dirty things can get at times when you got opposing forces and people who have goals. For example, his goal obviously was to protect the folks in his service in his union, and he went to some pretty extreme lengths. Other reactions? What did you guys back here think? Give me some feedback. Anyway. Surely you had a reaction when we pulled out the nail spikes. Yes?
I kind of like how he talked about the building. And even just the details of the steps. When he said there were men's hoops when they're on the stairs and stuff like that.
I'll admit, in all the research I've ever done on unions, that's a story I'd never heard before. And the story of the quote-unquote shoe room, and the fact that some of these people were actually being put into physical peril for that regard. Also, when I say physical peril, I mean the stories of women being sexually assaulted and the fact that people were essentially being owned by the company. I think that tied in nicely to a question that was asked earlier in terms of why did this stuff not come to light sooner than that. What else did you guys get out of Jim's conversation? Anything else? Yes?
I liked what he's doing now, for his modern day job of going around and trying to hold people accountable for their actions as well.
I agree too. And it's one of these things, guys, I think when we start thinking about the world of business, when we start talking about unions and management, labor management generically speaking, in fact, I'll say labor and management generically speaking, I think it's an important part for us to realize from our industrial heritage that laborers were not always protected. Some of the laws that we're talking about, for example, did not exist at the turn of the 20th century. When we think about the National Labor Relations Act, which we're going to be talking about today, that's 1935. So we're talking about literally 60 years after the Civil War, and we still did not have a defined working wage or minimum wage. We didn't have defined working hours. We didn't have protections for employees. These are big deals, guys. The stuff that we enjoy right now is really a product of recent history within several generations. For example, something like OSHA. Who here has ever heard of OSHA? Anybody know what it is? Yes?
It's like a set of safety standards?
It is. It's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Basically, what OSHA's entire reason for existing is to make sure when you walk into a public place or a building or a place of employment, you can be reasonably safe. If you want to know why we have handrails, if you want to know why we have mats in front of doors, why there's not power cords draped across the floor, that's all OSHA stuff. And so OSHA was an outgrowth of all this administration. So the very fact that we have fire alarms, and the very fact that these doors are not locking us in the building while we're doing our work, the very fact there's a curb in front of the building, the groundwork for all this stuff was being laid in the 1930s, even though we'd experienced decades of abuse of power by corporations. I said it before, I'll say it again. In the course of this class, I will not tell you if you should be pro or anti-organization in terms of organized labor. I will say that regardless of your stance on it in 2019, there was a time where it was needed. And the reasons that Jim was speaking about on Friday absolutely illustrate what some of the reasons were. Any other thoughts before we get in? Thoughts or questions? Okay. Guys, we have in the news, it's so funny, every time I turn around, I've got more stuff to bring in for you guys, some current events. And we're going to be talking about something that actually, prior to the recession. Guys, in terms of economic power, guys, if we go back to 2008, 2009, who can tell me what happened to GM? They got bailed out because what happened? That's exactly right. So we're talking about a company that was going bankrupt back prior to the recession. There was actually a joke. This, by the way, could show up as a bonus question on an exam. That people were saying GM stood for something else instead of General Motors. What were people calling it back in that point in time? Because they were bailed out by the feds. What did they call it? Government motors. People were, that was a term that people were using. There were people who basically were so opposed to the bailout, they said that they would buy a Ford or a Chrysler, but they would not buy a General Motors product because they didn't believe in the bailouts. A lot of people believe they should fail. Before we get into the issues behind this strike, from this news article, because we talked about the court of public opinion, even Jim Lamont on Friday was talking about how important it was to have a community behind you. What is your public perception? This being the first news article you've seen on this, what are your reactions in terms of how the union is packaging their side of the story? Do you feel sympathetic or not? What are your thoughts? Initial reactions. Don't worry about detail. Yes?
Initially, from like a logic standpoint, it makes sense, especially with what they said about bankruptcy and everything compared to now.
So we're saying on one hand, the company is doing gangbusters. Why don't we get a piece? Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the biggest things that stood out was since they got bailed out, the amount of profits they made, and it seems like the workers just kind of want to get a piece of that.
So we're talking about the workers saying, well, if your CEO is making $22 million a year, is that where you were going, Jason?
I was gonna add on that aside from the wages, there are two other major demands were job security and healthcare. And healthcare is just an issue that a lot of people are currently concerned about. And with job security, obviously that's something that happens in the motor industry because of the tendency for them to outsource jobs. So those both seem like pretty fair things to be concerned about.
And regardless of somebody's politics, that fits with the quote-unquote America First policies of the current administration, too. Are there things that made you non-sympathetic to the workers? Yes?
The one lady said, "We make quality cars," and I said, "No."
No. Had a bad experience with the GM, have you?
A couple.
Yeah, so no quality cars. Anything else that stuck out? What about you guys? From this side of the room, what did it say the average GM worker was making? Sorry, whoever. Go ahead. Go ahead, Emily.
Was it like 44 to 90 million?
Yeah, that's a pretty good living for somebody working on an assembly line, isn't it? And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be paid good wages, but those are pretty darn good wages. To some people who are making considerably less, that may take some of their sympathy down towards these workers. Was there another issue that you saw in terms of that might color these negotiations a bit? Yes?
Well, when they like threw in that last part where they're like, oh yeah, people in the union are being investigated for embezzlement, it's kind of like, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's like, we're just going to throw this bomb as we walk out the door here and see what happens. What's going on with the union at this point? There are allegations that some of the top members of the union were going to like $5,000 steak dinners on the union. I don't even know what a $5,000 steak looks like. Is that like when they actually bring in the cow and you go and cut the piece off that you want? They actually do it in front of you? Like, how do you have a $5,000 steak dinner? Like, if I, a $5,000 steak, I should want to die after that steak, saying I'll never have anything that comes close to being this good in my life ever again. But it's like, yeah, that doesn't paint a very positive picture of the union. Any other reactions before we get into a couple of the key issues here? Guys, what they're asking for, they're basically saying if GM is out of bankruptcy, and we're very profitable at this point. I mean, you saw GM made an $8 billion profit last year, which in the auto industry is really good at this point in time. How did Mary Barra, for anybody who has been following GM at all, how has she returned GM to profitability? Does anybody know this? If you're not following GM as a return story, you should. Guys, the way they've been really focusing on is quality, the idea of getting rid of products that people don't want. In fact, it led to a big plant closure last year in Ohio. Does anybody know what GM plant closed and why? Yes?
Was it the one near Youngstown, the cruise plant? Because a lot of automakers are like steering away from making sedans or cars.
Because people don't want small fuel-efficient vehicles. They want big honking trucks. And that's what it comes down to. You see it in the parking garages and the parking lots of America. We're not going for smaller cars. So Mary Barra made some moves that were very popular with shareholders. If you make your company more efficient and more effective and your stock price goes up, your investors are like, yeah, this is what we want. Your employees, not so much if it means downsizing people. Now, one of the other aspects, too, to GM in the future of this whole thing, who are the other two big American auto manufacturers?
Ford.
You got it. So we got Ford Motor Company and Fiat Chrysler, both of whom are union companies. So most of the rank and file are members of labor unions. GM is up first in terms of negotiations. They will set the tenet, they will set the pace, they will set the shape, what labor relations will look like with the other companies. What these guys decide in their contract will affect how Ford and Chrysler have their contract shaped as well. So the pressure is on both sides. If you're General Motors, you want to stand your ground because you don't want to lose anything. If you're United Auto Workers, you want the best deal you can get because you've got two more negotiations to get through that will follow suit with these guys. One of the other issues, by the way, on the bargaining table before we leave this is the idea that since 2008, GM has made heavier use of temporary employees. So what the union is saying is we want these folks to be allowed to become full-time employees so they can become dues-paying members of the union. General Motors retort to that as we want to retain our flexibility. So anyway, interesting stuff, guys. Any other comments before we jump into some content for today? Sir?
The $8,000, is that for every union member just signing on the new contract? You just get $8,000?
Sir, you are correct.
Is that taxed or no?
I would be taxed as income. But still, $8,000. You agreed to sign this contract, here's $8,000 for you. And if you're a higher paid member of the union, you're working on the assembly line making $99,000 a year. That's a pretty good, nice little perk on top of that. And if you're a member making $45,000 a year, it's an even bigger perk. So, yes, ma'am. You're correct. What happened back prior to the recession? Does anybody ever remember a car that's no longer made called the Chevy Cobalt? Cobalt. Every time GM sold a Cobalt, they lost money. They literally sold those cars at a loss. They did them to get people into the family. So in other words, you buy a Cobalt and have the opposite experience that Ryan had, and you have a good experience with the Cobalt, maybe you'll buy that Silverado pickup later on. The Silverado is a high-ticket item. So they had to literally sell, this is hearsay, this is what I hear from GM employees or from administration. They had to sell a Silverado pickup to make up for every two Cobalts they sold. They were losing that much money on Cobalts. Here's the other idea, too. A lot of people in these kinds of jobs, because they are union jobs and they have higher amounts of benefits. Does anybody know what a copay is when it comes to your insurance? That means what you have to pay before your insurance kicks in. I'll give you a great example. My copay for my personal insurance for my family is $4,500. I paid $4,500 out of my own pocket before I get coverage for most major medical conditions. GM employees had zero deductible plans, so they were very valuable healthcare plans. So it's called a high deductible plan. Come to my human resource management class and we'll talk all about it. But guys, we're getting into chapter 3. Our last chapter, we spent a lot of time talking about the history of organized labor. What we're really going to be getting into now is kind of the legality of it. Now, I always agree, or I always believe in being straight and honest with you guys. When we start getting into reading of the labor law, some of the stuff on the surface level can appear to be a little dry. What I really want you to be concerned with is why these laws were important and why they had impact. I'm not going to quiz you on every aspect of every statute, but I am going to ask you to tell me why that law was important. For example, we always talk about the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. We talked about it in the past 2 chapters. Why is that law important? We're talking about organized labor. Why is it important? If you don't remember, guys, it really legalized and stratified collective bargaining, and it also set things like the 8-hour workday and the 40-hour work week. That's why that law is important. So that's what I'm going to be concerned with you guys picking up about these laws. Now, guys, something also to keep in mind. Generally speaking, we start talking about labor law. It's called the preemption doctrine, and what this means is federal law, generally speaking, supersedes local law. After the documentary that we watched on the United Mine Workers and the speech from Jim Lamont, why do you think the feds made federal law supersede local law? Why would the feds, why would the United States government say that we're going to have strong central laws regarding labor? What do you think? Go ahead, Elliot.
When you have state and local ordinances kind of taking over areas, that can lead to a lot of issues for like humanitarian issues, financial issues, because you had all those towns that were like controlled by the company, and the only real way to stop those is to have federal government presence.
That's quite right. It's the same thing that we talked about with the company store. The very fact that we're human beings who essentially were owned by the companies they worked for is why the local law could no longer be trusted. The local law in many cases had been purchased by the companies themselves, and in some cases there was not even local law enforcement in terms of elected officials, but company militias, for example. And this left it to the judicial branch of our government to decide, for example, if a labor law was constitutional or not. So in terms of some of the big labor relations laws, we're going to be covering each of these, except for the Railway Labor Act, because we covered that earlier. Guys, if you remember, it came down to the idea that people who worked for railroads were allowed to organize. In the early 1900s and late 1800s, why was it so important that the railroads not go on strike? What do you think? Yes?
The main source of transportation.
That's exactly right. It was the lifeblood of the country. We just finished the Manifest Destiny expansion to the west, and we didn't have interstate highways. We did not have air transport. This is how goods and services got back and forth. Here's a trivia question for you guys, by the way. The system of interstate highways that we now enjoy, which came to pass allegedly in the 1940s and 50s in the United States, where did the idea come from? Because we were mainly a rail-based country until after World War II. Where did the idea come from?
Germany with their Autobahn.
The Autobahn. Guys, this is something that will come in when we start talking about the Teamsters Union. I know I'm jumping forward in history a little bit. When General Eisenhower was in Germany during World War II, Adolf Hitler designed their highway system to facilitate the quick movement of troops and supplies across Germany. Eisenhower saw it and said that would be a great transportation system for the United States. So our system of roads and interstate highways came from Nazi Germany in terms of learning the lessons of an evil regime, saying this is how we could benefit people. I digress. The labor strike that happened, the Pullman strike, which was largely behind Labor Day in the United States, really showed the power of labor unions in terms of what they could and could not do. But we're going to cover each one of these acts between Norris, LaGuardia, Wagner, Taft, and Landrum. So the main organizations who control labor in the United States, the biggest one, and the one we're going to probably spend the most time talking about, is the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. if we get into any kind of discussion about impasses between unions and labor and management, the National Labor Relations Board is who gets called in sometimes to arbitrate. If we get into forced arbitration, for example, as opposed to mediation, it means that they're decisions that are binding. All these other things fall under the NLRB, whether it's the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Services, conciliation services rather. That's federal negotiating services that are available. The U.S. Department of Labor, for example, that keeps our statistics about things like unemployment. The National Mediation Board, the National Railroad Adjustment Board, and all these agencies all come under the National Labor Relations Board at some level. And all this stuff is affiliated with the United States Department of Labor. That's administrative structure. I'm not saying it's not important. It's not what I want to spend the time talking about today. So guys, what we started talking about in 1932, this is prior to the National Labor Relations Act. We started off what we refer to as the Norris-LaGuardia Act. The big thing to remember from this, guys, prior to this time, a lot of companies would try to enforce what we refer to as yellow dog contracts. You can tell me what a yellow dog contract is. Rashawn, what's a yellow dog contract? Any guesses? EJ, can you help him out? What's a yellow dog contract? How about you, Justin? What's a yellow dog contract?
It's an agreement between employees and employers.
It is. Can anybody help these guys out? What's a yellow dog contract? What is the agreement? Yes.
Isn't it an agreement where like the negotiator gets a big deal and the labor kind of gets stiffed?
That's a sweetheart contract. What a yellow dog contract is. You go ahead, Adam.
Isn't it kind of like an agreement not to organize?
Bingo. If you sign a yellow dog contract, you're basically signing on your way in to say, I am not going to be a member of a labor union. It was deemed unenforceable by the Norris-LaGuardia Act in 1932. You can't ask people to do this. There was also a pro-union sentiment taking over the country at this point in time. Guys, if you remember, there was an event not too far from here that's turned the tide on public perception on unions. What event am I talking about? Involving the steel industry. It's in a part of Pittsburgh. Yes? It was the Homestead riots. We were talking about with the Andrew Carnegie and the Carnegie Steel, the idea that people were all of a sudden saying, yes, we have reasons to be members of labor unions because we're working people just like these folks are. The only problem with the Norris-LaGuardia Act in 1932, all these were great ideas in terms of saying, yes, you guys can have some power as individuals. The problem is there was no real agency tasked with enforcing it. It would be like if I came up with the idea, I'm paying you guys all $20 to come to class every day. Wouldn't that be great? If there's nobody holding me accountable, then what's to keep me from paying nothing for you to come to class? If I had $20 to pay each of you to come to class every day, I would, but I don't. That being said, the other thing in terms of unfair labor practices, the term was coined, but it wasn't really defined. So what's an unfair labor practice? If you're an employer, you might say, well, an unfair labor practice is somebody trying to get a raise. I don't want to pay more money for labor. An unfair labor practice to some employees might be having to work more than 3 hours without a break. There was no real definition to that term. Then we get into what we refer to as the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. Guys, something happened immediately before this, a few years prior, that destabilized the whole country. What am I talking about? I'm talking about history of the late 1920s in the United States. Yes?
Great Depression.
Yep, stock market crash that caused the Great Depression. If you're talking about 25% unemployment in this country, industry is not doing all that well. The National Industrial Recovery Act 1933 was not dissimilar from the economic stimulus of 2009 in the United States. Guys, who here knows what the economic stimulus was back during that period in time? I know that's from your adolescence, but it was signed into law by Barack Obama. Anybody know what that act was? When we say a stimulus, we're talking about something that spurs something. In 2008, when the bottom fell out of the economy going into 2009, what are people not doing? They're not working. If they're not working, what else aren't they doing?
Not buying.
They're not buying stuff. And the economy grinds to a standstill. All of a sudden, your GDP is not expanding, it's contracting, and your company is not doing well, and your country is not doing well. So what the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, it was a sort of anti-competitive act. It was the idea of saying, instead of having a true free market, we're going to come up with some standardized pricing to try to get our businesses back on track. Instead of paying market rates per se, we're going to have some predictability. Now, in terms of protecting employees, it wasn't good for that, because we're talking about the idea of putting leverage on people. The Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 was against the idea of using leverage and a free market. It was the idea of trying to get people back to work. Now, ultimately, this failed too, because the Supreme Court said in 1935, you cannot do this. It runs counter to a free market. Guys, when I talk about capitalism and the free market, what does that mean? What is capitalism at its core? Yes?
A system of commerce where the means of production are privately held.
Exactly right. And that applies to people, too. What this means, guys, is if I'm a person and I have a unique skill or ability that I can charge a premium for, why shouldn't I? What it also means is if I am able to organize with other people to be able to exert leverage on an employer, why shouldn't I? And that was why this act was viewed as unconstitutional. Guys, this is where we get into some real meat on the bones, though. We're talking about the Wagner Act and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. This is where blank got real. We're talking about the idea that if you wanted to form a union, you had protection from the U.S. government and the right to do so. So this established what we refer to as the NLRB. Now, you remember the Norris-LaGuardia Act. We had some of these great ideas, but we had nobody to back it up. We had nobody to enforce it. We had nobody to walk into a shop and say, you're engaged in unfair labor practices. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and I would write this down because it is absolutely the most important piece of legislation we'll probably talk about in this class. If you want to know why we have things like 8-hour working days, if you want to know why we have overtime law, it all stems from this moment. Guys, we were in the process of starting to come out of recession, and all of a sudden the idea that people should be treated well and that should be something that should be institutionalized became part of the argument. We're going to watch a brief video about the Wagner through. It got processed, it happened, largely probably because of public support. We're going to see that there are exceptions to the Wagner Act. There are businesses, for example, that are not covered under it, even to this day. Guys, if we had to think about the largest exception to labor law in the United States in terms of some place where the law doesn't always apply, what's the most common example in terms of labor law?
Family-owned businesses.
You got it. You work for a family-owned business, a lot of these laws simply do not apply. Because we're reaching the point in the class where it's time for us to open it up for our first 2 questions or comments. So what questions or comments can we answer for you today? Sir?
GM and the unions are negotiating. The main negotiator from GM, like, would it be the CEO? Would it be like people under her?
They can do it a lot of different ways. Typically, the question, guys, was who's going to be the lead negotiator for GM. A labor union can elect one of their own to be the representative, the person who negotiates. They can have a lawyer do it for them. It's different based on each company. If I were a betting man, I would dig me into GM a little bit. I would have a hard time believing it wouldn't be a lawyer of some description, just given the stakes we're talking about here. So that would be my 2 cents. I think that GM, by the way, actually let me ask you guys this. Is GM, are they making a smart move? Are the workers making a smart move by going on strike right now? If you were the head of the union for GM, would you support the idea of them striking or not at this point in time? Are they in a strong position to strike? What do you think? Yes?
I'd say yes, and that's mostly because there's a pretty low unemployment rate right now, so there's not a whole lot of people to replace those workers, and also just the fact that the current administration is very sort of protectionist and very pro-U.S. labor would probably make it harder for them to outsource the jobs anyway, if they even wanted to resort to that.
So they got some leverage right now in all the aspects you just mentioned, and the low unemployment rate, by the way, excellent point. Is there anybody who feels different? That GM might not be in a good place to negotiate? Any thoughts? Here's why I think that GM may be, the employees are taking a little bit of a risk here. I don't know if you guys picked this up from any of the other news coverage. Right now, most GM dealers, I don't know how many of you have driven by a Chevy or a Buick or a GMC dealer anytime recently, are those lots empty or full with vehicles? They're full. GM, by their most recent predictions, has about 2 months of inventory. So meaning they could weather a strike pretty easily. What would hit GM really hard is if this drug on into the next model year, and all of a sudden they're not getting the 2020s out, and some of those are already starting to arrive. And the other thing would be a part shortage. If we had, for example, people couldn't get axle assemblies or transmission parts, and all of a sudden your $55,000 GMC pickup is sitting in your driveway because you can't get a part for the transmission, that would put some public scrutiny on to what's happening. I think they're really in a tough spot in terms of if this goes more than a couple of days. This could get ugly. One more question or comment, guys, before we jump back in. Question or comment? Corey.
I have a question for my friend Justin. I just want to know how you're doing today. How'd your night go?
How are you, Justin? Are you having a good day?
I'm alright.
Just all right? Corey's concerned about you, apparently.
Yeah,
So
I am concerned about it.
yeah. So
I'm concerned about you, man. Yeah, the Falcons will get over it. Thank you.
it's like if Justin, if you want us to all come and give you a group hug or something, we could probably do that. But no, we're not going to do any group hugs in here, not today. That was a thank you for that little bit of an emotional kind of check-in. All right, guys, directly from the National Labor Relations Act this was 1947, a bit of a revision. The bottom line is that if you're going back to the NLRA, you have in writing that you have the right to organize and collectively bargain. It is the idea that people are allowed to form a union. That really is what was stratified and formalized in 1935. Now then we get into the post-war era. Guys, remember we talked in the last couple of classes. The unions did what during World War II? For the United States, what did the unions agree to? They would not go on strike. They wouldn't do massive increases in wages. They're saying, we're in this together. We got a war going on. We're in this together. Now, if you recall, what happened in 1946? Immediately after the war, what happened? Sarah. We've been tightening our belts for 5 years. We've agreed to your demands. We've switched the way our industries are working. We've adapted. It's time for you to give us our fair share. And what did the unions call in 1946 to put the country to a halt?
Wasn't it like, I don't know if the name, but a strike of kind of like all the unions nationally?
Correctamundo. They called it a general strike. And the idea is, okay, hey, you Teamsters, you're going on strike? Okay, us coal miners, we're going on strike too. And the steel workers, we're going on strike. And the United Auto Workers, we're going on strike too. And how about the railroads and the bus drivers? We're all going on strike. We're going to put the country to a standstill until you address the fact we've made sacrifices and we want what's ours. So the Taft-Hartley Act, it is no coincidence that this came out in 1947 to basically start giving us some more guidelines in terms of how to balance this stuff. We want to keep the unions happy, but we also want to make sure we've got clear designations. We got more definitions of what we're considered to be unfair labor practices. When I say this, guys, I know that we haven't gotten into the definition, so to speak. What would define an unfair labor practice? Think about yourselves as workers. What would be an unfair labor practice to you? What's something that you would see in a working condition that would not be in your best interest or be unfair? I'll give you an easy one. Go ahead, Elliot.
I was going to say, if you're working somewhere and there's like an open flame or something.
Safety. Yeah, so that now even goes into unsafe working conditions. That certainly could be unfair. Let's say, for example, Todd's my boss, and I'm working for him this week, and I'm working hard for him, man. He's got me busting my ass. And I got 45 hours in, and I'm like, hey, Todd, I'm up for overtime. Todd says back to me, and I'd like you to actually say this back to me. Screw you, Tonkin, you take your overtime next week. And he's not paying me time and a half because he says, that's not in the budget. That's what Todd said to me. That's an unfair labor standard or an unfair labor practice as well because you're breaking the law. If you're asking people to do things that are illegal, that is an unfair labor practice. If you are not hiring people in a discriminatory manner, which is something that came out in the 1960s when we had the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that comes down to an unfair labor practice. All this stuff crosses over. If you're breaking the law, if you're asking employees to do things or work under conditions that are illegal, that's definitely an unfair labor practice. So what we also started was giving states some kind of definition to say how can we manage this stuff. And it set up 3 different designations. We have what we referred to as union shops, open shops, and agency shops. Now, as we will see when we get into subsequent chapters, these were initial designations, and they did change over time. A union shop means if you're going to work here, if you're part of the rank and file, if you're not in management, if you're in labor, you've got to be a member of the union. And that means that you pay dues and you're represented. If you are an open shop, it means that you cannot make somebody be a member of the labor union. And then you get into what we call agency shops. And that means that people are paying for representation, and you can choose not to be in the union and still pay for representation. So you can be in a union shop where everybody's got to be a member. You can be in an open shop where you've got choice. You can be in an agency shop where the only thing you're paying for is representation. So you can be a member of the union or not and still get represented. Now, here's where it gets a little dicey, guys. In an open shop, technically, if there's a collective bargaining agreement in place, you can still not pay union dues and still feel the benefit of the contract. So it gets a little dicey. Guys, it also allowed unions to be sued. You remember our friend, I won't mention his name on the recording, our friend was talking about on Friday some of the practices that the union had engaged in negotiation. Can anybody think of one of those acts that might have been illegal? What might have been an illegal act? Yes?
The cow traps on the road, the pop semi-truck tires.
The idea of popping tires off of quote-unquote scab vehicles is definitely an illegal act. So, yeah, what they're basically saying in 1947, if you got a union getting into those kind of strong-arm tactics, you can sue the union. Keep in mind, guys, but I won't ask you for details, but how many of you have ever heard of Jimmy Hoffa? All right, Jimmy Hoffa was legendary in the labor movement. He starts to come to prominence in that time. He also had strong associations with organized crime, meaning that there were some illicit things going on. If you ask anybody who knows anything about certain labor unions, there was some alliance with organized crime. It got some bad reputations for the unions as well. So guys, then we get into the idea of the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act in 1959. Guys, what we're essentially talking about here is how we can set rules for union elections. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, that people in this room decided to form a union. And we decided we're going to do a vote. And just pretend on this, guys. All right, guys, by show of hands, who here wants to be in the union? Okay, we had 3 people raise their hands, 4 people raise their hands. Raise your hand if you don't want to be in the union. If you have not raised your hand yet, please raise your hand. Just please raise your hand. It's not that hard. Guys, for the 2 or 3 people who said they wanted in the union, and for the 12 other people who did not want in the union, what's the problem for those 3 people right now?
I've got to have a lot of bargaining power when we have so few members.
That's exactly right. And could these folks also be up for some sort of reparations outside of the working hours? They're like, hey, Jason, I saw you had your hand up, man. Stop that stuff. We don't want that here. So the idea being that we're going to have secret ballots. Guys, people don't always vote their real beliefs when they have to do it in a public forum. Because if you got to stand up and say, this is what I believe, and stand up in front of a room full of people, there could be consequences for stating your behavior. So we basically said at this point, if you're going to be electing unions or union officers, it's got to be a secret ballot. In terms of union membership, they said basically if you wanted to set dues or set amounts you're going to take out of paychecks, yes, you have to be a member of the union to be in those conversations. They also said that basically you have to have reporting too. If you're a labor union and you're collecting $5 in dues from everybody at the end of their pay shift, what are you using that money for? You got to be accountable for your actions. And it also meant that other people who might be what we refer to as secondary employers could also sue for damages. And you may ask yourself, what's a secondary employer? Let's say, for example, I have a shop and the people who work in my loading docks are members of a labor union. And the trucking company that picks up the stuff from my docks is not a union company. And those folks suffer economic damages because of the strike. They can also sue the union too. All this came out of the idea of trying to give some push and pull for labor and management so that we had some balance. So, guys, we're going to hit this one on the head here on Wednesday. So we're going to start off talking about the functions of the NLRB because the National Labor Relations Board really comes into enforcing the National Labor Relations Act. It's the other half of the equation. Guys, have a wonderful day. Yeah.
Tell you I was going on Friday for a golf match.
No worries.
Yeah,
No worries.
I totally forgot. And then whenever you said that he was here, I was like, oh, I missed that.
No worries.
But yeah, I forgot. I just thought I'd tell you.
Passing on a message to, I was working with your coach on something not related, and she had nothing but nice things to say about you.
Yeah, she's awesome.
She's really cool, and
Yeah.
I mentioned I had some women's golf team members in class, and she mentioned you by name.
Yeah.
So you're highly regarded by your coach.
Oh, that's really nice. Thank you.
Have a good day. See you in a bit.